most of you know, my name is Stephen Kepnes. I am Director of Chapel House and the Fund for the Study of the Great Religions of the World, which is now the Fund for the Study of the Religions of the World. We have really an incredible, distinguished series of panelists here tonight who will address the issue global conflict. Could religion be part of the solution? We've actually been talking about religion and global conflict up at Chapel House for the last 2 days, and we had a minor experience of scriptural reasoning. Some of you know what that is. And we had a very nice dinner, so everyone should be ready to do this. So the first person will be Dr. Jocelyn Cesari, who is here. She is a senior fellow at Georgetown in the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and also a professor at the Harvard Divinity School. After that, there will be responses from James Patton, who is the executive president and COO of International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. Then Nicholas Adams in the end. Professor Nicholas Adams is in the Department of Theology and Religion. He teaches at the University of Birmingham. And then we have Daniel Roth, who is there, almost at the end, right next to Nick, who is a faculty director at the Center for Judaism and Conflict Resolution, Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, and also Bar-Ilan University in Israel. And then finally we have Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon, who is a minister of the Evangelical Covenant Church and has had many positions in peace work throughout the Middle East and in the world. I'll say, I think I already mentioned that this is sponsored by the Fund for the Study of World Religions, also Peace and Conflict Studies, and the Program of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies. So please welcome Jocelyn Cesari, who will begin and speak just for 10 minutes or so. Then each of our respondents will speak for 5 or 7 minutes, and then I hope we can have some dialogue on this important and interesting topic. So, Professor Cesari.
Good evening. So my short presentation will be based on a sort of position.
So Jocelyn, the mic, I think, maybe you got to...
Can you hear me? It's better?
Yeah, that's better.
But we can't see you so well.
Yeah.
It's either or, right? No, I think you can hear me. I cannot put it more.
If you bend it like this, maybe? That's what we mean? Okay.
Is it better? So,
there's nothing she can do? Okay. You should sit down and use one of these mics.
no, I'm fine. I like to stand.
Are the cables on those mics long enough to bring over to the podium?
It's okay. You can hear me. I used to teach in an amphitheater with 800 students without microphone, so I guess I can talk without. So it's based on a position paper that was requested by UNESCO. They have this year published a big book on what they call the rapprochement of cultures, and they asked me to present a position on religion and world affairs. So I'm going to pretty much stick to the script of this brief paper because it does summarize, I think, a few points that are now very much debated, or at least more present in the ear of policymakers. So my position here is really to engage with an arena, either domestic politics or international politics, where religion has been absent for at least 1648. 1648, yes, you are laughing, but it's true. 1648 is the Westphalian Treaty. It's the emergence of the international system as we know it now. And it's based on a very clear principle. After Europe gets out very traumatized from the war of religion, the idea is no more. and meaning no more the secular reality is going to take over the trouble caused by religions, either domestically or internationally. And so it means that religion disappears. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any influence. It means that deliberately the international system will be based and built on a rejection or negation of the importance of religion. And it's the job of the rulers, either the king and then the elected constituency, to maintain religion domestically and to regulate religion domestically as much as possible. That's why also the idea that to be secular is to be separating religion and politics is actually very marginal in the way that most of states have actually dealt with religion everywhere, even the European secular democracies. Actually, there are only 2 countries in the world that separate religion and politics in the sense as we know it. It's France and the US. All the other European secular democracies do not separate. They control, they regulate, they supervise, they suggest, recommend, but they do not separate. So here already we are on a big historical reality that has nothing to do with, I would say, lots of the theory we hear about what is secular and what is not. So this is one thing that we have to keep in mind. And why I'm insisting on that? Because even when policymakers are not coming either from France and the US, they have still the idea that the best order possible is a separation of state and religion, while the reality of the world doesn't see that. Does it mean that you cannot be secular? The response is no, you can be secular. Again, the best example I have in mind is India. India is secular. I mean, I'm not saying it goes very well everywhere, but there is no separation. I can mention to you Belgium, tiny little space, is secular, but the state pays the priest, the rabbi, the pastors, now the imams are on the payroll too, fund the religion in public schools. So what does make Belgium secular? I'm not going to respond to that, but it means that we have to think differently of what is secular. And this is a real challenge. So this is the first challenge is this kind of generalization of what is secular, what is good for the domestic and international politics, and the negation of religion internationally. So that's why in 1935, Joseph Stalin, when he was asked about the importance of the Vatican, responded, how many battalions, how many tanks does the Vatican have? This summarized pretty well the mindset of policymakers and scholars of politics when it comes to the role of religion internationally. I'm going to jump forward because I have already almost used all my time. The change will come for the discipline, not for the people. Again, I'm not telling you here the story of groups on the ground. I'm telling you the story of the perception and the legitimacy of religion in scholarship and in policy making with 9/11. It starts a little before, but 9/11 is really the turning point, and the fact that, yes, we have to deal with religion. So it will already here posit a bias because it's the idea that religion is a threat to the international secular system, and that religion has to be addressed through the angle of security or terrorism studies or terrorist concern in general, which is a very limited and I would say counterproductive approach to religion. And so what does it mean? Why is it scholarly limited and politically counterproductive? Because the best example I can have is it's also now common parlance in all political debate on religion. It's Huntington and the Clash of Civilization, because it does summarize pretty efficiently the bias or the limits of the political approach to religion. I usually say Huntington was half right and half wrong. Half right because he's the first, coming from a very realist or realist school of international affairs to say, maybe norms, values, it doesn't talk about religion as such, norms, values, civilization, culture matter, and maybe people fight for that, and not only to expand territory or to gain more wealth. So already this is a big little bomb in the domain of international relations where people do not look at that. And in America, 70-80% of the colleagues who do IR, international relations, are still not convinced that religion matters. So this was a good move, but the other part of the move was to look at civilization in a very essentialized, primordial way. When there are students here in the room, so when you start listing features on a piece of paper about what is a distinctive feature of this group, this religion, this culture, we are on risky territories because these principles can be implemented, embodied in multiple or very contradictory situations. So this is the half move that will make his approach irrelevant in the sense that instead of producing knowledge, it will produce or reinforce this idea that religion is trouble internationally and that it is the only way to deal with it is to contain the terrorist or security issues related to religion. And it also goes with this idea that religion can be apprehended if you know the text. I'm not saying that the text is not important, don't misunderstand me, but if you think that going to the text will help you understand the reality, and this is more for policymakers, the reality of today and how religions are debated and used by different protagonists, you are wrong. That's what I say. I always ask my students when they were closer to 9/11, what did you do after 9/11? It was very interesting. Most of my American students, unlike the European one, they would go and buy the Quran in a bookstore. And we're telling them it's a very remarkable move, but it doesn't help you understand Bin Laden. It cannot help you understand Bin Laden. So, unfortunately, that's also the tendency of policymakers when they want to understand a religion. They do what I call, the 101 religion. Being a scholar of Islam, it means that everybody now knows about the 5 pillars and the Prophet Muhammad. But does it help you understand what ISIS is doing in Iraq? Does it help you understand what is the situation of the Muslim Brothers in Egypt or in Morocco? Probably not. So the point is not to say that texts don't matter. The point is to say that there is some kind of identification, interaction between different poles of religious authorities and discourses and different groups of agents, political or religious or civil, that is the crux of the matter. So in other words, it's not so much to say that I find the reality of the situation in the text, but to look at a situation and see how texts are object of conflict between different groups. If I can be a little more concrete, I spent some time in South Africa, and lots of young Muslims who fought with Christians and Jews against the apartheid were doing it on the basis of texts that ISIS is using now to behead people. So you talk to these people and they say, I don't know what's going on. I'm very uncomfortable here now to know that the same text I use to fight against apartheid are used by people to do the opposite. So is it in the text? So the text has a context, this is basic kind of assertion, but it is an important one, and it means that you start with the context and not with the text. And it also means that religion cannot be limited to ideas, doctrines, or belief, or creeds of belief. What I have learned in my long journey among Muslims is you can talk about, I mean, even if you listen to ISIS, it's not about belief. It's about how people are behaving as believers and to what they belong to. Do I belong to the nation, the Ummah? Do I behave in a certain way as a man, as a woman, as a Muslim, as a non-Muslim? This is what is at stake, really. And what I have also witnessed is that sometimes this belonging doesn't automatically match the theological argumentary or argumentation, and that it may be matching or overlapping with political or collective identification or belonging. And that's why the Ummah, for example, becomes a political entity and not automatically a religious or theological concept as scholars of Islam think of it. And that's the kind of thing that politicians have to be aware of, in the sense that this contextualized approach has to go away from only taking into account the discourse of the religious authorities, but looking also at what people do without automatically putting words on it. But it's also religion. And it's part of this interaction, and again, moving from the context to the text and back, more in a sort of dialectic than thinking that the text is omnipotent in giving you explanation for all situations. So yes, religion matters. And one word, if we want to get away from only security, we can look at the positive role of religion in economic development. Again, another way to look at, if you go to the street of New York City, you may see lots of Senegalese merchants selling, different kind of goods of different, from cheap to expensive. And you can say, oh, these people are doing business. Yes, they are doing religion. They are part of a Tijani conference where doing business in this moment has nothing to do with mercantile profit. It has to do with being part of a hierarchical system where this money will go and be part of a redistribution channel for social justice. So yes, we can look at them at business, and they will never talk about God, Allah, and theological discussion. But this is what is behaving. And I give you this example, but I can multiply examples from other religious traditions. And another positive example of religion is religion and democracy. How did Latin America turn into, with lots of bumps along the road, but there have been a huge move from authoritarian military regime to democracy. And the Catholic Church has been a very important element to that. When we forget that the Catholic Church for a long time has a close alliance with all authoritarian and sometimes very fascist regime like in Italy and Spain, what happened? This is an important move of supporting resistance against authoritarian regime. And that's why you see how, for example, the encyclical and the Vatican II Council had a very positive impact on some leaders in different contexts. So you see how it goes both ways, the text, the context, and the text, in a sort of spiral that never ends. So history is not linear, if I may just do that.
Okay, and then we should move to...
History is not like that. And there's a story of religion and politics.
Okay, so James, Matt,
Stacey.
you can just stay there. I'm going to see if I can get some more light.
I agree.
Yeah.
No, this is fine. So let me take a step back. Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Should I project? The question of whether or not religion matters is really not a question. 85% of the human community considers one of its primary identity markers to be its religious identity, and I would contend that a large number of the other 15% perhaps don't use that language, but they have a spiritual process, and so it's in the room. Whether we like it or not, it's in the room. How it functions is part of what I think we're grappling with when we talk about conflict. So I start a lot of these conversations and say, you think of religion and conflict. That's the first thing that comes to mind. And very rarely, I won't put anybody on the spot, but very rarely do people immediately think of the positive role that religion has played in resolving conflicts throughout the history of humanity, which is probably more compelling than the negative role, or at least equally compelling to the negative role that it's played throughout history. And so, can it be part of the solution? Could it be part of the solution? It's in the dynamic, whether you like it or not. And so, it must be part of the solution. The questions are, do we know how to make that happen? And more importantly, do we even understand how it's functioning so we can engage with it correctly? And I think you touched on a lot of that. But religion itself is value neutral. It's like money or TV or anything else. It's a tool. And how you employ it, I mean, a lot of people say money is the root of all evil, but without money, a lot of folks would starve to death. So there's a positive benefit to that as well. Religion is the same. It is value neutral, and it takes on value in its application in relationships. The question is, what is the goal? And then, therefore, how do you try to affect it in relationships? And what elements of it do you try to amplify or diminish? You know, what people do you have in the room? What texts do you engage with? All of this is going to be distinct depending on the context that you go into. The effort that we at ICRD have put into affecting, and that's the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, affecting the engagement with religion in conflict transformation has largely been trying to bridge this with traditional efforts at conflict transformation, which is to say folks who are afraid of or dismissive of religion and its role in conflict transformation. I think you mentioned this as well. The State Department historically has been somewhat pathologically afraid of having discussions about religion. If they do have them, it's about religious actors primarily rather than faith and faith content. And I think the fact that we have been unable to understand that aspect of religion, not just the role of leaders in mobilizing others or the role of text as a narrative, but the actual transcendent element of faith, has made our engagements in trying to change conflict or trying to start functional conflicts, let's call them, interventions in recent years by the U.S. military, has made them deeply flawed. So part of what we try to do is we try to normalize the function of religion for state actors and others in a way that allows it to be worked with in a more of a standard conflict analysis and intervention framework. The fact of the way religion functions in society is not terribly different than the way that other things function. It has institutions, it has narratives and communities, and it has values. So I would say this is the structural, the community level, and the individual level. Much of that is similar to how a lot of other things function. I've worked a lot with gangs in South America, soccer gangs, for example, in Colombia, and the colors and the team and the stories they tell and the way they meet, where they meet, what they do, what they chant. This is very religious stuff in a lot of ways. It's very similar to things that you'll encounter in a religious space. They may claim that the team is their deity and the team told them to do it, but there's a tiny little piece of religion that functions slightly differently, which is this transcendent piece. That's the element that maybe should give traditional actors a little bit of fear, and they need to find someone who's able to bridge that. But largely, the way that religion functions can be normalized in conflict analysis and intervention. What needs to not happen is to have it be siloed. Have it be religion for religion, by religion, for the religious nutties over there doing their religion thing, right? And you see a lot of this happen, and unfortunately, this really damages the full integration of religion into practice. If 85% of people are religious, and if you are a silo of the religious, you're left with 15 of every 100 persons in the room, and that's not a very potent tool to be using. And it's actually not even true of the groups that you do find in the policy-making sphere. Many of them have a faith tradition, whether they're Defense Department, intelligence agencies, State Department. So to recognize that that functions in their own identity, and to be able to integrate other people's identities into their spectrum, their playbook of identities when they're in relationship in a conflict space, would seem like it should be natural. If you don't do this at all, you leave it in the hands of other folks who tend to be zealots, whether it's in the institutions of the state or outside of them, and we know the danger of that. And if you do it poorly, oftentimes you do more damage than good, and I think this is some of the interpretive piece that you touched on, is be very careful with it and cautious with it, particularly in places where it is the single most important authority in people's lives. Yeah, I was going to expound a little on the multiplicity of identities and not siloing, but I think I touched on it. So I'll leave it there. And just to let you know, ICRD does this in many contexts around the world, so we look at the practical element of it.
Okay,
Good evening. Am I satisfactorily audible? I have a strange accent. Apparently I have an accent. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you to Professor Ketnes and to Colgate University for hosting this event. My short contribution can be summed up in 3 words with a question mark. What about God? But I want to begin some appreciation for how Professor Cesari began in 1848 with the Peace of Westphalia. So 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. In the importance of thinking historically about the questions before us about how religion is part of the solution. So to reiterate, it is a very recent idea in human thinking that religion can, let alone should, be excluded from aspects of making war, making peace, and so forth. So the first element of a reparative move in trying to undo anti-historical thinking is to think historically. Because there is very little history anywhere that is not religious in some sense. So that's a straightforward way of being attentive to where we've come from and our origins. So the first repair is going to be historical. I want to head to the 19th century a little bit. To talk about certain habits of thinking which feed into a tendency to think that religion needs to be excluded, and to distinguish between 2 strategies for excluding religion, or at least why one would want to. So the first is something which comes on the scene in a big way publicly in the mid-19th century, overwhelmingly in Germany, which is very tight with a French intellectual tradition at that time, which is the idea that something finite, something in the world, something material, is being dressed up falsely as something infinite, something immaterial, something spiritual. There is an illusion at work, to use the language later deployed by Freud. If that's true, that there's something finite, something touchable, that's being mistakenly and illusorily parsed as something immaterial, the task is very straightforward, which is to talk about what's really being talked about. So the task is going to be to retranslate the infinite, to retranslate the divine, to retranslate the spiritual, and so forth, into material, touchable, tangible, real things. So many of the great atheist thinkers of the 19th century explicitly set themselves that task. How do we undo the illusion that religion is? If you then add to that the extremely potent idea that religious folk are ignorant and violent and are predisposed to be savages in our midst, in the European and North American civilization, then clearly one needs to get rid of religion if one needs to get rid of the violence that's caused by religion. Well, we have 2 ideas combined here. The first is that religion is illusory, and the second is that religion is violent. 2 good reasons to get rid of it. And if you follow the fate of contemporary atheist discourse, it's constantly splitting between these 2 things. So it's violent and it's an illusion. Either one of those would be a good reason to get rid of it. So the repair of this way of thinking, then, tends to address the violence question. And to say, as Professor Cesari very eloquently put to us, that the dangers posed by certain forms of violence in the world cannot be satisfactorily addressed without including religious agents and addressing the religious motivations and identities of the agents. And we had a very nice, pragmatic approach for that, including Colombian football, gang, as you call it. So that's one element, but that's only one of the two. That addresses the issue of the inevitable so-called violence of religion. One can undo that and say, no, one needs to engage with the 85% of the world's population, one needs to engage with the identities and self-understandings of agents, one needs to take seriously the motivations if one is to undo certain forms of violence. But what about the first? What about this notion that when people talk about God, they're really talking about something else, and they just mistake it for God? This seems to me utterly untouched by a pragmatic turn to trying to rescue religion as an important category for addressing religious violence. And I wonder, and I don't have a straightforward answer to this, I want to pose this to you as a little mini research project which you might undertake whenever anyone is trying to tell you about religion and violence, which is the task to re-include religion as a source of peace because religion is important to people. Might it be the case that it's because God is the source of peace and that the religious traditions have some way of dealing with a reality more than something that is describable as an illusion? If God is an illusion, if God is not the source of peace, if God is merely talk about something else that's not God, mistaken talk about something else that's not God, then trying to rehabilitate religion on pragmatic grounds in order to address religious violence is going to have something of a strange quality of these weird nutters, was the word that you used, religious nutters. They need to be somehow appeased. No, indeed. This was the State Department. I think that one of the crucial forms of small investigation that we should pursue in trying to understand the importance of religious discourse for dealing with religious violence, and it's not only pragmatically to say it would be a good idea to include the 85%, which is a pragmatic argument, but also to suggest that the reason for doing this is precisely because religious traditions do engage with the reality of divine action in many traditions, and that this is the source of peace that needs to be recovered. So an unapologetically theological challenge to those who would pragmatically rehabilitate religion, bracketing the question of God.
Thank you. Okay, Daniel Roth.
Okay. So I think for many Americans, 9/11 was sort of the re-entry, if you will, of religion back into politics, whether we liked it or not. For me, coming from Jerusalem and living in Israel, today marks 20 years, slightly before 9/11, in 1995, when there was the political assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And for many Israelis, that was the re-entry of religion back into politics. And that began, like what happened in America, where people started searching, well, what is the role of religion, and how can it not only be a cause of violence, but we have to kind of see how it could be part of the solution. There was an expression back in the Oslo days, starting in 1993, that what are we going to do with all these religious spoilers, as they were referred? And the solution was that we're going to take all the religious Jews and put them in a synagogue and lock the door and throw away the key. And then we're going to take all the religious Muslims, put them in a mosque, lock the door and throw away the key, and we're going to make peace between secular-looking American Palestinians and secular-looking American Israelis, and we'll have a nice, rational, secular peace. And surprising, that actually didn't work. And what's even more surprising is that they keep on trying over and over again to recycle the same failed peace initiatives and consistently surprised that they're not working. And one of the reasons why they're not working, in my opinion, is because we're dealing here with, and often in the cases of religious conflict, is with identity conflict. and not just simply as it's known, scarcity of resource conflict. And when we're dealing with identity conflict, we have to go deep, deep in and broad within the identity of that religious community. There are no quick fixes. These things are not solved in 2 weeks or even in a couple of years, and then everybody's identity has now been healed and peaceful. These things have to do with lots and lots of history, of fears, and primarily, which I want to focus on for a minute, of how people read text. You mentioned text, the 101, but I want to say there's a couple of, as somebody who comes from the world of text, there's a couple of very important contributions that text play in how we can engage religious identity both deep and broad. The first, as we've mentioned throughout our time together, Professor Scott Appleby, in his ambivalence of the sacred that James, you were alluding to about that religion does not promote peace, it does not promote violence, it can do this, it can do that. It's the return to ambiguity of the text. That there is not a singular or linear reading that automatically promotes it one way or the other. And there has been important research that I think contributes to this, which is, can we return to curiosity of how this text can be read one way or the other? But I think that only diffuses religious conflict. But I think religious text offers a lot more to the world of peace building than just simply putting out a religious time bomb. It also has tremendous deep wisdom systems that have ancient cultures and traditions that I think often secular peace, with its very rational utilitarian thinking, is often falling short. And I think these religious traditions, if taken seriously, actually have a lot to contribute. So a lot of the work that I personally have been involved is going deep into religious traditions, looking at how there have been practices of peacemaking or engaging in constructive conflict, comparing it to Western models, and blending the two towards practice. How can we create, using these materials, curriculum for schools and training religious leaders? Is part of the work that I think can be done that will seem that the texts make it extremely familiar, extremely safe, and extremely part of people's religious identities and religious practice, and not as some kind of secular, colonialistic, now we want you to be more Western type of thinking. And I'll add, on the level of practice, also in the wake of Rabin's assassination, I think often when we have moments of crisis, creativity can grow out of that there are certain important NGOs that actually employ texts in order to promote a culture of peace, or at least of constructive conflict. For example, a wonderful organization called Yisodot, founded right after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, engages with some of the most religious spoiler schools in teaching democracy using Jewish texts. And similar programs have now been set up in using Sharia and democracy education within some of the Arab Islamic schools within Israel as well. So these are just a couple of the examples, but there are many others of how text and text study can actually become, like we've been talking about scriptural reasoning, that I believe some of you are familiar with, can be really part of the solution for how to go deep and broad. I'll mention very briefly the work of your colleague, Dr. Miriam Kay, who lives in Israel and has taken the world of scriptural reasoning to a very practical place by training hospital staff in Israel, where it's one of the very few spaces of coexistence, where you have all sorts of different identities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, people working together and serving people that are from different identities, engaging in text study about medical and care and healing. And it just brings the text and the identity and creating that as part of their deeper culture, I think, all the more forward and very practical. So I'll just conclude by saying, sometimes I think we can feel like we're just not doing enough, and there aren't, things that just, we've been engaging in this for about 20 years, and we haven't solved all the religious conflicts in the world. Are we doing something wrong? And I think the answer is, when you look at how certain trends within society have taken hundreds of years, for example, human rights, how many years does it take until it becomes core to cultures and traditions? I think some of the work that we're doing, sometimes forced upon us by tragedy, will hopefully become work that will work towards building cultures of peace and healthy conflict. So,
Last but not least, Cannon.
It's a privilege to be here with you tonight, so thank you. You might be here because you have to for a class, but thank you nonetheless for being present and staying awake and engaged, as I know you all are. I thought that I would start. I just have a few pragmatic points. My primary vocational identity has been in the context of religion. I'm ordained in the Evangelical Covenant and have served in many local churches. And just in the last 5 to 10 years or so, have begun engaging in consulting with the U.S. government. And so half of the language of the State Department and certain things that we talk about, I have no idea like what it means. And I'm seeking to understand it from my own context. But I can say the State Department, part of why it is so anti-religious, or at least has that reputation, is because of its history of many of the foreign service officers a long, long time ago were the children of missionaries. And so I think they're experiencing post-traumatic stress as missionary kids, and that's have a bit of an aversion to religion. But with the question of can religion be a part of the solution, I absolutely believe that to be true. And I thought that I would offer just some observations from some experience and things I've been learning from the panel here and in the conversation we've been having the last day or so, and then also from my own experiences. But I think one, and this has actually already been mentioned, religion does a lot of good in the world. We just don't talk about it, and the news doesn't report it. But it really does. And so where are there places where we can learn and be educated about the stories of where people of faith, devout people of faith, are doing really, really wonderful things? And they're doing it in the name of God. And an example that I would use is the Egyptian Revolution. I was living in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in 2010 and 2011, and was in Egypt during before and after the Egyptian Revolution. And the religious dynamic of January 25th, and at least the first round, it was beautiful. It was inspiring. You had people who had their cheeks painted with the cross and the crescent, and you had Muslims protecting Christians so they could pray and not be accosted or having stones thrown at them, and you had Christians, evangelicals, imagine that, protecting Muslims so that they could pray, and yet all you saw in the West was the cover of Time magazine, and you had an angry Arab man. He wasn't Arab, he was Egyptian, but never mind that, he was angry. And so part of what I think we need to learn from one another is some of the beautiful, beautiful stories of people of faith doing really wonderful things. That being the case, I think also we need to be very concerned that sometimes religion causes a lot of harm. And it's really, really good intended, wonderful people who just want a better life for their children, and they're motivated and inspired by these texts and by our faith and by our devotion, and yet when we engage, we do things that harm people. And so what does it mean for us as faithful people who are religiously engaged to not cause harm as we seek to engage? And there are books and books written about that. I'm not so Kantian to think that the ethic of intentionality is all that matters. I think that we need to be concerned about what happens when we engage and don't understand the consequences, even though we may have the best of intentions. I think as well that our posture of the way that we enter into these conversations is really, really critical. I am an evangelical, and evangelicals don't have a reputation for listening well. And so what does it mean for us to be listeners who can learn from one another, who can presume that we don't have all the answers, that our identity doesn't need to be compromised as we enter into these spaces. And I think often that part of the work that we need to do as leaders is to create space for more constructive conversation where we can learn from one another. I'm wrestling a bit. We've been talking about ambiguity. We've been talking about that in the context of scriptural reasoning. And this has to do with what does it mean for us to have integrity in our own religious identity, that I don't need to compromise that in order to be able to enter into conversations with people of different faiths. And so I'm not one who believes, as an evangelical, there are very, very clear definitions of what that means. And yet, I don't know that ambiguity, I think I might use a different word for it. This is something I want to wrestle with, because I think that we can create space for conversation where we can still maintain our beliefs and come to the table and create space for questions. I don't think that questions means that there has to be ambiguity in our own religious identity. So that's something I'm wrestling with a bit. But finally, and this is where I'll close, I think that often we presume that as people of different faiths and different ideas and different interpretations and different backgrounds and different experiences that we have nothing in common. And yet I think that that's not true. I think as we come to the table as people who care about religion, be it academically and from a distance, or be it personally as people who have faith and beliefs, I believe that we do have a lot in common. And one of the things I hear and see all around the world is that people often have a desire to see the world be a better place that is not full of violence. That often people who are actors in different communities all they desire is to have a better world for their children. Now, their methodology of how they pursue that may be in question, but the common goal, or the goal at hand, is a common one. And so I think we need to create space to wrestle with what does it mean for us to engage religious leaders, political leaders, and civil society to create space for peace, not for violence. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
Okay, so I guess everyone here thinks that religion can play a role in peacemaking. But I think that's kind of like the minority. That's not like the most commonly held perception. So it's great that we all have this common denominator, but even within that small minority, then you have people approaching from a pragmatic approach, theological approach, scriptural approach. So how would you all come to the table and then reconcile those differences, even though you're striving for a common goal with the same tool, but different approaches?
It's a big rock to lift, and so all hands that can help lift it are welcome from all angles. I think the question is not necessarily reconciling, it's sharing and encouraging one another to aspire effectively towards the same goal.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think that part of the reason why we're gathered here is part of the global covenant of religions. Make sure I got the C right. Is how to bring people that are actually coming from very different disciplines. Some of us engage more in the philosophical, theological, some more in the practical, some more in the textual, some, and have that meeting of the minds, which I think is a great opportunity. So.
I don't know that I agree that we're the minority in terms of, maybe we are, and I'm just an idealist, but I mean, in terms of, I think, you mentioned these statistics of how many people consider themselves religious. I just think in the U.S. context, religion has been so separated from politics and has been so separated that there's not been a lot of space where the integration can happen. And so I think that's part of what we're seeking to do.
I think it's a wonderful question, because you're supposing that we must somehow agree amongst ourselves and resolve our differences before we can do any kind of activity together. And I think that one of the reasons why we're gathered together, working together, is that we share a commitment to working together without needing to resolve those differences first. In other words, the ground doesn't need to be cleared before we can get to work. There's a certain sense in which the work can be done together in the midst of really quite irreconcilable differences on some pretty fundamental issues. And that mirrors the religious reality in which a lot of this peacemaking takes place. There's no way we're going to agree about things. And the more severe disagreements tend to be within religious traditions and not across them. So you'll have whenever two members of one religious tradition are gathered together, that's where really big differences of opinion will show up. But it needs to be resolved before we act. And we're not the minority. We are a huge majority in thinking that religion is key.
Are we?
Yeah, we are.
good. That's good news. I hope you're all encouraged.
I don't know. I'm not sure about that we are the majority yet. I mean, in the numbers of people who believe that for whom religion is important, yes. If we look, and there is now a year ahead of us of celebration about the Westphalian system, the international system remains very secular. It has changed. It has been eroded by different kind of forces, transnational, non-state actors. But even today, if you want to be heard, you have to create a state. Otherwise, you don't exist, really. I mean, even if people hate you or want to defeat you, you have to create a state. For me, ISIS is a parody of that, but it says something, about still the legitimacy of a kind of system where you have to be recognized into a certain form. The only group that has explicitly made its goal to destroy this system, and in my opinion it's more radical than ISIS, is Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda doesn't want the system, it wants it destroyed. But look at all the other actors that you consider bad guys. They are still part of the system. The nuclear agreement on Iran is a case in point of how you are accepted slowly, painfully, but you become part of the system. Nothing in the nuclear agreement of Iran has to do with theology. I mean, unless I'm mistaken, but So there is something here that is still very strong. And of course it doesn't cover what people are doing, but we have to be very clear that and this is the political scientist in me, okay? The mechanism of political decision remain resiliently secular. And that it does affect the way that people, when they act religiously, have to operate within the system. It's just not, so that's just my point of caution here about, And I completely second what Professor Adam was saying, in the sense that the consensus is not the homogenization. Consensus means we agree on certain way of acting or priority of agenda. Doesn't mean that we have to come all from the same. Actually, it would be very unhealthy if we were all, operating with the same parameter.
May I add one brief note on this question of majority and minority? The overwhelming majority of religious people are not embracing violence. I think most people can agree with that. I would say the overwhelming majority of religious people believe religion is playing a good role in their lives, or they might stop. I mean, Job might be an exception, right? Those are the seeds of playing a positive role in the world. If we can get to the consciousness as human individuals that our fellows are beyond our immediate family, beyond our village, beyond our in-group, and actually start to grow that circle into whether you believe in God's creation or whether you believe in the divine through line through all of humanity, if we can move those principles operating in people's lives around faith, which are overwhelming in terms of faith identity, into the broader human social interaction, and I include with that the interaction with the environment and ourselves, then I don't think we're in the minority. The seeds are there, overwhelmingly so.
Peter, yeah.
The panel will respond to a couple of questions. One, do you believe that current non-religion involved diplomacy has a good track record in responding to and ameliorating religion-specific violence? And let's stay with that.
You're all writing?
I think you're doing great. We're not really needed at all.
The question was, is diplomacy, standard diplomacy, succeeding in dealing with religion-related violence? And soon then suggesting that we need to introduce more attention to religion, but I wondered about the preliminary assumption. Without introducing religion, is diplomacy capable already of handling this? And if so, why add religion?
No, but I mean, I would put your question is that where diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, has been successful in solving any kind of violence, not only the violence of religion. I mean, we are dealing with an international system that is unable and capable to sort out, a very violent crisis, even if they are not religious, and that's part of the issue here. And it's also the limit of the traditional diplomacy. I mean, we know that, but so the religious violence is not a specific. It's a specific challenge for the secular diplomat because they think that there is something here that needs to be killed, or needs to be tamed more than in any other violence, which is a wrong perception based on the secular mentality that we were talking about, but they are not going to look for other resources from religion to solve the conflict. You see what I'm trying to?
Oh yeah.
I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think of resolving violence as a linear process. We're starting in a violent time, we're going to move to a less violent time. It's this history. I mean, it's a cyclical, generational issue. And humans are just grotesquely good at violence. We seem to be much better at that than we are at other kinds of relationships. And so I agree with what you said. That was what I was going to say as well. We're just bad at doing violence. It keeps happening. We're not establishing consistent mechanisms that solve the generational challenge of addressing this again next time. And so maybe we need to let go of that and instead build adaptable mechanisms that are good at dealing with it when it comes up next generation. And maybe that's what we leave behind, is something that functions this way, whether it's religious or not. But I do think part of that is using all the tools at your disposal, which includes finding a way to bridge different identities, whether they're faith-based or traditional diplomacy or any other kind of identity mark or tools.
This is a wonderful question, and I think it really reveals the kind of scale at which thinking is undertaken in relation to this. So if the problem is religious agents engaged in massively aggressive violence, that violence needs to be shut down, and it can be totally shut down with non-religious diplomacy. You can shut violence down simply by being stronger. You don't need to engage with the subtleties of religious discourse to shut down flare-ups of religious violence. You just need to shut it down, and that needs doing. And I think that one of the arguments that really needs to be made by those of us who want to argue for the reintroduction of religiously articulate and sensitive diplomacy isn't you need to understand religion to stop people fighting. You can stop people fighting. The problem is the scale and the time, particularly the time scale for what you want to achieve. If you want to stop people fighting, you can simply overwhelm them with force, and that will do the job. If you want them to continue not to fight after you have lifted that overwhelming force, then something else is needed. And we're having much head-scratching and soul-searching in Britain at the moment over the involvement of the UK government in the invasion of Iraq and the unseating of Saddam Hussein. There's a big report about to come out in which all kinds of activity will be in the public eye once again. And the question is incorrectly going to be focused, to my mind, on whether there should have been an attempt to be aggressive in Iraq. That's an important question about just war. But the really outrageous lack of discussion that will attend that report is on the whole question of how you maintain and support a certain kind of peacefulness between religious traditions. And it's that you cannot have long-term reductions in religious violence simply by overwhelming force. So taking away religion, maybe it would remove the oxygen from a fire for a short period of time. If you really want the fire not to keep breaking out, something much, much more subtle needs to happen. So I think that the scale at which I would want us to focus our attention isn't simply on stopping the violence. It's on long-term relations between religious traditions, which mean that the conditions for violence not continually breaking out are sought. And that, it seems to me, can only be done by taking religion seriously.
Yes. Oh, no, go ahead.
I want to follow up on this, and I will admit my bias as an international human rights legal scholar. But noticeably absent has been any mention to some of the new ones that have been developed in the international community. I mean, the UN was deliberately created by a Confucian practice of Confucianism, Judaism, and a quote Arabist. Those were the Delano Roosevelt, the formulas of the UN. And I guess I'd like to hear your response of whether you think the entire international human rights judicial system has failed. The idea that countries are willing to give up some sovereignty so they could be part of an international community to work towards certain peaceful means, and whether you've given up on any role that the international human rights legal system could play. Maybe that's not a fair question, but I can't help but wondering what role. And let me say one more thing about that. I mean, within the international human rights community, we are constantly fighting about universalists versus cultural relativism. And it seems to me that's also part, it has to be part of your discussion. When you say religion, I'm a little anxious about how broad you're painting that religion brush into different categories. So can you tease that out for me a little bit?
Can I start on that? I think it's a very, very important question because, as you said, today this question is, there are two divided responses, the one that are seen universalist and also imperialistic, and the one that are seen completely culturalist and denying the importance of human rights. And again, if you turn to the people in different arenas, you see that even in the culture that are far from the so-called center of the West, where this agenda comes from, are aware of it, that they have translated it into different kinds of modes of action and claims, and it's very condescending for the culturalists in some big capitals to say, oh, we don't need human rights, this doesn't work this way. This kind of agenda is now part of a global discussion. It does have its own, I would say, grafted products in different areas. It doesn't mean that it duplicates the original, but it means that this concern for human rights is everywhere. So the task is, how do you take into account these claims without automatically, projecting on them the Western origin or the Western preoccupation of it. And that's the most important thing. But I would say that it's part of one of the success, not of the international system of states as such, but this international community. This is a jargon, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do it anyway. You have the international system, which is the addition of all the states and non-state actors, and people come here, and sometimes they share ideas, and sometimes they don't. Most of the time they don't, hence the violence. And then you have the international society, which is a much more ambitious project on binding people and groups on some shared concerns, values, and project. And I would say that despite what culturalists are saying, human rights is part of this international society. But again, it's not the point is not to homogenize and make everybody with the same agenda everywhere. That's why I'm going to be a little unpolitically correct, but when I hear that the agenda for everybody now should be to advance LGBT everywhere, that's not the case. Some areas are there, some are not. And that's the problem when this kind of agenda are defined either in Paris or in Washington or London.
Other people want to respond?
I guess so. Where we need to human rights. That's what
sorry.
Well, yeah, maybe
I was just going to say, and maybe this connects also a little bit to the previous question, is that so long as it is perceived as a secular system, it's going to be felt, experienced as a secular gun of law, faith, posed at the religious community, almost like it's going to threaten and dismantle their systems. I mean enough that some words like social justice, human rights, even peace are used as like linguistic weapons against religious communities. So what's important, I think, is how can some of these values be mined first in the religious community and saying these are actually not secular values, but these are actually core to religious values, and have that. Perhaps there might be some negotiation over what the values exactly are and how far they're going to extend, but they can be found within religion. There are religious, legal thinkers that have alluded to such ideas, and to the extent that they can be grounded as a religious experience and translated that way, I think then there can be a cooperation around them. And the same thing with secular diplomacy, by the way. If it's perceived, secular diplomacy might also be experienced as a religious act, if it's interpreted that way. Even religious diplomacy could be interpreted as heretical. It's a question of how we're going to be able to engage in the interpretation of those experiences.
Don, you want to ask your question? That would be the last one.
Okay. First, just a historical point is that both Mahatma Gandhi and the American Anthropological Association were against the UN Charter of Human Rights because in the one case they felt it was an offense against religion, and on the other hand, an offense against culture. So that's a whole other conversation we should have, which is interesting. But I wanted to really ask, I was intrigued by this expression of, where is God in all of this? Because I find that a very, I'm attracted to that question. And we all can think of individuals or exemplars who have been motivated by or enervated by kind of religious worldview or being to be involved in peacemaking. But the fact is that even within the relatively small scope of the people represented here, who are mostly drawn from the so-called Abrahamic traditions, and right, but there's a huge diversity in what people even mean when they talk about God. So can you envision that question somehow being not just of relevance to an individual or a group of people who have a particular kind of religious motivation, but how could you operationalize that question on a larger scale, right? To motivate state actors or non-state actors that are not kind of church groups or something like that. Can you imagine that being done? And that's really to anybody.
No. I think that operationalizing of the question, it's not that I don't think it can be done, I just can't imagine how it could be done. So I'd be open to being taught on that. I was wanting to suggest rather that the question of God's peaceableness is core to my understanding of why one would want to include religiously literate action. When it comes to persuading governments how they should pursue their diplomacy, I would not phrase that at all in those terms. I can't see what effects that could possibly have other than to confuse the issue. But as a religious person, I think that question should not be bracketed indefinitely. So it's more of an openness question to how one understands God's peaceableness. I don't think that the role of intellectual discourse in this is to try and find some overarching claim about the divine and say, well, in Christianity it's understood in this way, in Judaism this way. That seems to me crazily 19th century overarching overview, which is not available to us as finite creatures. I do think that the discussions between the religious traditions in their explorations of what it means to talk about God's peaceableness is a fruitful line of inquiry for those of us who want to take religion seriously in addressing religious violence. But that's not a discourse which is appropriate everywhere. I just think it would be a shame in a conversation like this in the university if the questions were not posed.
Okay, thank you all very much.